for the next couple of days. And I'm delighted to introduce shortly the second session, which is about transforming the warehouse sector. If I can use this as an opportunity to, first of all, thank our sponsors and just encourage everybody to use the networking spaces on your Swapcard platform where you can engage with each other. Also to point you to the live discussion where you can ask questions. We'll be feeding those to the panel as well. But please do engage with us in each of the sessions. Obviously, your input is absolutely critical to having a good discussion around these topics. So I'm delighted to introduce Clare Bottle, who is the CEO of the UK Warehousing Association. If I can ask Clare, you, James and Chris to come on screen. What I can say before handing over to Clare is this is going to be a really interesting session for those of us who may not be either involved or had much contact in the warehousing sector. But from a trade perspective, that touch point between trade, goods and warehouse is absolutely crucial. And to the earlier point made this morning is we've got to do this together if we're going to digitalize trade. So it's really, really important that we understand what's going on in the warehousing sector and how we can interrelate and support work there and how that connects into the trading ecosystem worldwide. So Clare, I'm going to stop talking and hand over to you and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Chris. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and be working with the International Chamber of Commerce. I'm going to start by introducing myself and then I'll invite our other two panelists to introduce themselves as well. So my name's Clare Bottle, as you can no doubt see on the screen. And after about 25 years working in operational logistics, last year I became the Chief Executive of the UK Warehousing Association. We're a trade body. We represent about 900 member companies. And my role includes providing benefits to our members, such as access to expert advice or organising prestigious events. Our next big event is going to be our awards lunch, which is coming up in June, and entries to the awards have to be in by next Monday. So I feel like I ought to mention that in case we've got companies listening who are interested. UKWA is also the voice of our industry with government, with the media and with the public. And I'd just like to mention that in my so-called spare time, I'm also the Vice Chair of Women in Logistics. And I'm passionate about making our industry as inclusive and diverse as it could be. So that's me. Let me hand over to our panelists. And Chris, maybe I could come to you first. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Claire, and good morning, everybody. So I'm Chris Warren. Since 2018, I've been the Global Logistics Director for Pentland Brands. Our portfolio includes Speedo, Berghaus, Mitre, Canterbury, and various other brands that you've hopefully heard of. Prior to that, I held some senior supply chain roles at Sainsbury's, Home Retail Group and Whitbread. And in addition to that, I actually started my career with a global 3PL. Very simplistically, my role is to lead Pentland's logistics function to ensure that it's future-proofed and supports the delivery of our business objectives. And I'm looking forward to being part of the panel today.
Great, and we're looking forward to hearing more from you as well, Chris, so thank you. And James, if I could come to you next, could you introduce yourself, please?
I will, thank you, Claire. Hi, my name's James Moffatt. I'm currently presenting from Wakefield, so I'm in the plant today and in the warehouse. And as you can see, I've got my uniform on, so this wasn't a choice of attire. I've been in the Coca-Cola system for 14 years, and currently I am the operations manager in CCEP Wakefield. CCEP Wakefield's our largest and most complex logistics operation across the CCEP structure. So I get to run the biggest and most complex warehouse in the Coke system in this part of the world, which is very exciting. In terms of things that I'm passionate about, one is people development, not so topical for this discussion today. The other is moving logistics towards no touch and exploring opportunities for digitalisation, which is hopefully where I can add something to this discussion. So that's me. As I said, thanks for having me, and looking forward to seeing what we get into.
Absolutely, and I'm sure you'll have a lot to add. So thank you, James, and thanks, Chris, as well. So to kick off and get us started, I think let's introduce the role of warehouses in the supply chain. Why do we have warehouses? What are they for? What's the story of warehousing? And of course, we're talking from a UK perspective, but trying to think globally with respect to our audience on the call here today. So I'll start by giving a bit of an explanation, and then I'll come to the other panelists as well. So warehousing, what's it all about? Well, I think the first thing I'd like to explain is the difference between 3PL, which Chris just mentioned, and own account warehousing. So certainly in the UK, we have about 1/3 of the warehouses are operated by 3PLs, and that's third-party logistics companies. And those will be companies, probably DHL is the biggest one that you might know globally, companies which offer a warehousing service and store goods that they don't own inside the warehouse. Own account warehousing is a bit different, and I think that's, James is speaking to us from an own account warehouse for Coca-Cola, which is where the company that owns the goods also operates the warehouse. And in the UK, about 2/3 of warehouses are own account and about 1/3 are 3PL. So those are really the sort of two different types of warehousing, or at least that's one of the ways that you can distinguish them. Globally at the moment, we're seeing a real growth in warehousing. And again, using the UK as an example, since 2015, we now have about 32% more warehouse space than we had 6 or 7 years ago. And I think there are probably two factors that are driving that. So one of them is about the growth of e-commerce. And that means that the marshalling area, or the area where you prepare goods, needs to be bigger. And that's because when you're preparing goods to dispatch them to a manufacturing site or to a retail outlet, that doesn't take up as much space as preparing individual parcels to send them to consumers' home addresses. So that's driving a growth in warehouse space. But there's another factor as well, which is about the tension between having a just-in-time supply chain and having a resilient supply chain. And what we're finding is that there are some global issues which are encouraging companies to hold more stock than ever before, because they want to be able to deliver excellent standards of customer service in a volatile market. And so that's another reason why warehouse space is growing, because not only do we need more marshalling space for the type of activities that are going on in warehouses, but we also need more storage space because we're just holding more stock. So that's a bit of context about the role of the warehouse in the supply chain, but let's talk to some real life practitioners about examples from your own supply chains. So maybe Chris, I could come to you and ask you, why do Pentland use warehouses? What's it all about for you?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. So for us, I think there's been an evolution in warehousing. So if I talk about Pentland for a moment, so Pentland traditionally was a very UK-centric wholesale business, and as a result of that, we've operated our own warehouses for many years. But as our business has started to globalize and we've entered new markets, actually for us a hybrid model is more suitable, because to pick up on Claire's points, it's finding the right optimal solution where you actually need to operate your own warehouse or potentially have a third-party partner to support that. Now, speed is hugely important for all consumers now. There is an expectation that product is available when people want it, where they want it from. And with that, it puts a lot of pressure onto anybody's supply chain, because that fulfillment needs to happen now and it needs to happen quickly. So whereas warehouses predominantly were there to store product for when they were potentially sold, that warehouse now acts much more of a fulfillment center. And for us, actually, we started to change our language around the word warehouse even, because warehouses, as I said, traditionally were around holding inventory ready to sell to a consumer or holding raw materials ready to go into a manufacturing environment. Now that needs to be a lot more fluid, because in conjunction with the customer expectation around having products available immediately, cash flow is significantly more important than it was before, and people need to hold a level of inventory that allows cash flow to be protected. So gone are the days where product sits in warehouses for months and months and becomes dusty and sold. It has to flow through a lot faster. And that's really where the definition of fulfillment center has come for us. And where we've tried to penetrate new markets, that speed to be able to partner with somebody that has a level of infrastructure, a level of software, people capability, equipment capability, technology, it allows that investment to be a lot lighter touch, and it means that we can invest in marketing. It means we can invest in better product. It means we can invest in understanding our consumer more, because we've got a partner that has a skill set of capabilities to be able to provide that fulfillment solution for us. However, I think there has to be a balance with that, and I think the pandemic has really given the logistics industry and warehouses particularly a huge level of exposure. Goes back to that expectation from consumers. If we remember that the world came to a standstill only 2 years ago, and all of a sudden everybody started to order their products online. So warehouses had to have a plan in place to be able to respond to that change in consumer behavior overnight. And that goes to us. So the word flexibility is hugely important. Warehouses need to be flexible, they need to be agile, because they need to react, because the consumer is changing, the world is more volatile than it ever was before. And, you know, James made a point earlier about some of his interests, and he spoke about people. I think let's not forget that the people working in the warehouses as well are hugely important. And I think for Pentland, we wouldn't have got through the pandemic without our people. You know, everybody, you know, when the pandemic hit, everybody started working from home. They started ordering online. Well, there still needed to be an infrastructure to support that change in consumer behavior. People that were working in warehouses, they couldn't do their job from their living room or their bedroom, or if they were lucky enough to have a home office, they had to go into work. And it's our people that were able to not just for Pentland, but in all warehouses, were able to keep economies moving and keep businesses operating and continue to allow people to eat, have medicine, and also, you know, apparel and technology products as well. So I think the evolution of warehousing and fulfillment centres has changed like never before. And I think one of the proudest things that I have now working in this industry is that there is a significant more level of understanding and appreciation for what the warehouse offers to economies.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think in some economies, the warehouse worker was designated as a key worker, which was a level of recognition we hadn't really seen before. So absolutely. And James, maybe I can come to you. Would you like to tell us something about Coca-Cola Euro-Pacific Partners and how you use warehouses? What's the role of the warehouse in your supply chain?
I will, thanks. It's a great question, and one that I don't get asked very often. So why, you know, why do you have a warehouse? I think often in certainly in our world, we would just take for granted that that's answered. However, for somebody that might not be in logistics or supply chain, I'll explain briefly what happens. So if you imagine as a consumer, you would go into either into a store or into a licensed outlet, and you want to drink one of our brands. So imagine you're in an airport and you go into a WH Smith's and you want to pick up a can of Diet Coke. If the extreme of not having any warehousing and just having a just-in-time model would be, you go and you want that product, and then WH Smith's call us up, we call the manufacturing line, we make the can, we take it down the manufacturing line, and then we deliver it to the WH Smith's. Now, clearly as a consumer, you might be stood there waiting 2 days for you to get your product. So we don't do that. We do the exact opposite, which is we try and make sure that our brands are available as much as possible in as many locations as we can where they're listed. And the way we do that is we make batches of products. So we've got 700 SKUs in CCP and GB. So an SKU would be an individual product. So if you took a can of Diet Coke in a 12 pack, for example, that would be one product. So we make that available, we store it in the warehouse, and then as the customer orders it, they buy it from us, we deliver it to them. They store some in their warehouse, and then they move it on down the supply chain into the store. So the role of the warehouse really allows us to sort of decouple a little bit the demands of the consumer and the availability and flexibility of manufacturing. So the fine balance and the thing that we're trying to achieve all the time in supply chain is how do we maximize availability so we never miss a sale at the most optimum cost. And doing it at the most optimum cost allows us to do two things. One is maximize the profitability of our business, and the other is provide the brands at the most competitive price for the consumers. So it's as Chris mentioned, it's a super important area in terms of supply chain and logistics, and it's been, despite everything that's happened with the pandemic, it's been a really significant few years for our industry, because suddenly supply chains, it's been on the front pages of the newspapers, people have been talking about it on the news. Suddenly warehousing and logistics is interesting perhaps to people where it wouldn't have been before. So I think in that sense, it's given us a real opportunity as an industry to start to have a voice in places we perhaps wouldn't have had before. And finally, I think historically, when you would look at a business and look at the P&L, you'd see sort of logistics or supply chain as a big cost on the balance sheet, and ideally keep it as small as possible and maximize the profitability of the business. What's now happening is, because of all the constraints that exist in supply chain, whether it's in GB last year, it was availability of haulage, availability of direct labor. What's now happening is that the supply chain is probably the single most influential factor in whether a business is constrained in terms of how much it can grow or not. And that's been a significant shift in the market. So yeah, I think that probably covers it, Claire.
So the perception from consumers and the perception from the business, it feels like both of those have been changing. But I'd like to build on what you two have just talked about by asking a slightly different question about different types of product and how those supply chains work. So I'm going to make a very sort of bold assumption, and I'm sure you'll be able to break this down for me. But in a company like Coca-Cola, your product is heavy and cheap. And in a company like Pentland, your product is lighter and more expensive. So if I were to compare a can of Coke with a swimming costume from Speedo, I guess what I'm getting at is that you might be more inclined to have a more global supply chain with a product that has a higher profit margin and is less expensive to transport, like a Pentland product. And you might be more likely to have more regionally based supply chains for heavier and cheaper products like the Coca-Cola ones. Maybe I'll ask if either of you can disabuse me if I've misunderstood, or say a bit more about the difference between maybe warehouses that operate for import and export versus those that are more kind of locally serving a regional market.
Yeah, I'll comment a little bit on Coke first, and then I'll hand over to Chris. So I think the good description of our product's been cheap. I think we can get you to help when we're trying to like cost price increases and all that sort of stuff with the market. So I think if you think about somebody buying a 24 pack of Diet Coke as an example, and they're going to pay £8 for it, £8.50, something like that, if it's on offer in a retailer. If you imagine the amount it costs to then just deliver that unit to their house, it's highly unlikely that that's going to be something that's going to work for the consumer. So that they might be paying several pounds just for one item to be delivered. So when you look at the supply chain, the ideal way it works for us is we either access our consumers through one of our customers, which would be a retailer in the home market. Or if we were to try and do some sort of direct-to-consumer approach, there's a significant logistics cost that comes with that. So the challenge that we've got, again, is how do we make the product available to consumers in as many places as possible in a way that is cost-efficient for them. So we're not pricing ourselves and then out of the market. I imagine, I'm sure Chris will tell us, but that's different to paying sort of an 8, 9, 10 quid for a case of pop versus 30, 40, 50 quid for something that you're going to wear. There's clearly a different route to the consumer, and I think ultimately that's what drives how the rest of the supply chain set up.
Yeah, Chris, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, no, I think there are differences, but there's also a lot of similarities actually. So I think it really does depend on the product and who the consumer is. So if you think for Pentland, our biggest selling product is a pair of goggles. And we sell millions and millions of goggles around the world. And whether we sell that pair of goggles in the US, in India, in Australia, in the UK, actually it's the same pair of goggles. It can follow a relatively simple and automated process through our distribution centers. And we can use data technology to be able to forecast where that product should be and whether that should be in a global warehouse, a regional warehouse, a bit of both, etc. I think where the difference comes is to your point earlier, Claire, it's when that higher price point starts to hit. So, we sell jackets for £500. We don't want to be holding jackets in multiple warehouses across the world in case we sell them. So actually having a global stock pool is more cost effective from an inventory management perspective. And then also how we present that product to the consumer. So if you've ordered a pair of $14.99 goggles on Amazon, then for them to arrive in an Amazon package to your door whenever they're delivered is fine. But if you spend £500 on a jacket, there's an expectation that actually you know exactly where that jacket is within the supply chain when it's in the warehouse, when it's left the warehouse, who it's being delivered by. The packaging that comes with is very different. It's presented in a different way. It's much more higher end. So it goes back to that point I made earlier about warehouses, fulfillment centers. They need to be flexible because consumer expectations are now very different. The products are ranging very differently, and depending on which channel you purchase it from, makes a huge difference to how that's fulfilled as well. And for us, we are truly a multi-channel retailer. You know, whether that's selling in bulk to the likes of JD Sports, Sports Direct, or selling, you know, as I said, a £500 jacket to a consumer in Switzerland. So flexibility is hugely important, but it's getting that balance and understanding from that product perspective, which for me goes to an efficient warehouse is really driven by everything that you do upstream. So it's the decisions that you're making when you're building your ranges, you're building your product portfolios. It's the decisions that you're making when you're forecasting your demand. It's the decisions that you're making where you want to hold stock pools. That then makes the whole warehousing infrastructure run a lot more efficiently or a lot less efficiently, depending on how effective those upstream activities are.
Okay, got it. Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that's given everybody a good introduction into warehousing and what it's all about. So let's home in a bit on digitalisation. And what does digitalisation really mean in a warehouse? What's the digital landscape like in warehousing right now? James, I wonder if I can come to you first with that question, because I think you said in your introduction it's a particular area of personal interest, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So there's two different ways I'd look at digitalisation. So one is the method that's been deployed for a long time now, certainly all the time I've been working. There's been elements of digitalisation that have been present. So I'd say in the main, what we try and do is reflect reality digitally. So that's if I look across most of our processes and the way we operate, effectively what we'll be doing is completing some sort of physical activity, so that, and you might see some of them behind me, they'll be moving pallets around, and as they're doing that, we're also recording that activity in the system. So that means that at any time, if I want to know where a pallet is or I want to know the status of the delivery, I don't have to go in the warehouse and look for the pallet. I can just look in the system and it tells me where it is. So if you take our current warehouse, we've got 40,000 pallets here. And we'll move around 4 million pallets a year through the warehouse. So it would be impossible for somebody to manually keep track of all of that. So the system does that, but in effect, what it's doing is just mirroring the physical process. So what happens is the focus of the teams then and effectively the warehouse process becomes about completing the physical and then making sure that the digital accurately represents the physical. When that happens, it's then possible to start doing all sorts of things. So if I've got data that tells me where everything's been moved historically, if I've got, I can start to make predictions on what's going to happen in the future, and that allows me to optimize significantly more than I ever would have been able to was reliant on just a a manual process without any digital intervention. So that's sort of the first step. And I'd say at the moment, certainly in what we do and in the other parts of the industry, I've seen it. I think that's fairly well advanced. There's not many warehouses that are left running now where somebody stood with a piece of paper, writing down where everything is. If any, it'd be interesting to see one if there is still one of those around. And then the second aspect to it is then how do you get a warehouse that is just digital? So in the way that it runs, instead of reflecting reality, you just have one reality, which would be the digital. So that there'd be a part, for example, an automated truck or an automated piece of technology that's connected into the system and is part of the system itself. So instead of trying to keep the two aligned in terms of the physical and the digital, there is just one digital process. And that's really the where we're starting to go into now. There's lots of things like automation and AI and robotics have been talked about a fair amount in the industry for the past few years, and I think that's to me that's now what digitalisation means. The other thing that happens is if you imagine, so in our supply chain we'll have a set of suppliers that are bringing raw materials into us, that they'll have their own production processes, their own warehouses, their own transport companies. They then bring raw materials into us. We make that into a finished product. We then have our own warehouses and transport companies and customers. So across the whole supply chain, there's a huge range of different systems, different digital maturity, and different levels of willingness for wanting to go and play and advance in this space. So what that means is it's not possible just to sit back and think, right, I'll come up with one digital solution that I'll put in across the full supply chain. There's a load of factors that come into play when thinking about that type of thing, and I think we'll probably touch on that a little bit more as we go into the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really interesting. Thank you. And Chris, maybe I can pose the same question to you. So from Pentland's point of view, what does digitalisation mean in your warehouses?
Yeah, I think, first and foremost, very similar to James in terms of digitalisation, technology, automation has had a huge difference in how efficient and how we operate our warehouses. I think what we're seeing now and the ask that's coming from the business in terms of the next stage of digitalisation is really how, from a warehousing perspective, is how can we talk to the consumer more and how can we be more transparent in what we do. So, I think digitalisation, it's been around for a while. It's going to continue to develop. It's going to continue to sort of present us with lots of new opportunities and ways of working. However, I think, that consumer interaction piece for me is all around sustainability. So, consumers are extremely more considered than they ever have been before in terms of what they buy. They want to explicitly understand the sustainability credentials of a brand or of a product. Now, traditionally, that's been focused on raw materials that have been used to sort of make that product, where that product has been manufactured, are they good conditions within the factory, etc. However, what we're seeing now is that shifting to more of the overall operation of a business, and right smack bang in the middle of that is logistics and warehousing. It's becoming more of a primary consideration for consumers. And to my earlier point, about the pre-pandemic, nobody really knew what logistics and warehousing was. It's now got much more of a focus, much more of an understanding, much more of a presence. People are interested a lot more. And for us is how can digitalisation help us promote that environmental awareness to our consumers? How can we show that we're operating a low ecological footprint? How can we demonstrate that the CO2 emissions in our facilities are at the very least offsetting each other? How can we show that we've got the right packaging and the right materials and MHE that we're using in our warehouses? How can we sort of extend that just a little bit further than the warehouses as well? Are we using electric vehicles? Not sort of necessarily for the final delivery, but are we using those in our warehouses, to help with picking and packing? what software can we potentially introduce that makes us more efficient? Can we bring in recyclable energy sources so we can start generating zero carbon from generating waste within our facilities, etc.? So, you know, for me, digitalisation is a huge part of being able to understand that, be better at it, and show the consumer what we're doing so that they feel that we're making the right decisions in our entire supply chain. So they want to buy our product because they feel that our product is ethical, and we're trying to do the right thing for the environment. I think any organisation, if they don't show transparency in that space in the very near future, then they won't be able to remain competitive regardless of how strong their products are. And, you know, from a Pentland perspective, it's a huge part of our positive business strategy is being able to build those supply chain milestones within our sustainability strategy. So for me, is digitalisation is a massive enabler for us to be able to start operating in that way.
Really interesting there as well. And I think in both cases, what we're hearing about is digitalisation is an enabler for all sorts of things you might want to achieve, but those are maybe perceived differently by different stakeholders within the supply chain. So James talked a bit about the various levels of digital maturity of customers and suppliers. And Chris, you've talked about a perspective from consumers that we maybe hadn't seen 10 or 15 years ago, and how digitalisation can help support that. I'll come back to you both in a moment to see if you've got anything further that you want to add on that point, but let me just reflect on some of my thoughts about stakeholders in businesses, because I think certainly from my own experience of warehousing, you have sometimes a bit of a kind of tension between the expectations of financial users and operational users of data. And what I mean by that is the person who's running the warehouse wants to use digitalisation to help them be efficient and work out what's stored where, whether the order's fulfilled or not, whether there are any shortages or whether there's too much stock, and to sort of use data and digitalisation for operational purposes that help to make the warehouse run like clockwork. But financial stakeholders in a business, you know, the accounts department or the financial director, are also at the same time thinking about working capital, thinking about the value of stock, and they've got regulatory requirements that they have to comply with, you know, making sure that we know exactly where does the title of that stock sit, who owns what stock, how much is it worth, and is the balance sheet correct? And as I say, you know, there are sort of legal implications as well as the financial ones there. So I suppose you could say that's another example of where digitalisation has to serve a lot of masters all at once. Maybe I'll come back to you, James. Is there anything further you would want to say about the role of digitalisation in warehousing?
I think probably just to touch a little bit more on this idea of needing some form of harmonisation across the whole supply chain. And I saw some of the questions popping through on the Q&A around, you know, how do we look to do something that enables digitalisation across the whole sort of ecosystem of the supply chain rather than just doing it in pockets. It's a super interesting industry because we got the paradox of we need harmonisation in order to be efficient, but then at the same time, everyone's trying to create their own competitive advantage. So like the thing that I want to go and do to become more efficient, I need to tell people about and do it with them in order to realise the benefits. And we've never seen that play out as in such an extreme way as we are in sustainability at the moment. So if you take, for example, the idea of switching to electric trucks, it might be that they cost more money to buy, you know, and there's an upfront requirement that people are going to have to invest more. In most networks, they're not standalone networks, so that the people that are playing in the supply chain will often be, you know, working with multiple companies at once. So as an example, we might want to go and, you know, invest in electric trucks with some partners, but then there'd be another company that might not have the same availability or the same willingness to do it. So because of that, the supply chain can't adopt, you know, certain things until everybody adopts it. And it's the irony of the industry that we operate in, that we really need competitive advantage to keep being more efficient and driving the business forward. But we kind of need to do it together. So I think it plays into sustainability. It also plays into digitalisation as well, because if we've got technologies that we want to implement, for example, if we want to gather more data on tracking products, for example, and be able to see that through the life of one of our products, we require different people to share data with us to do that. If you could take a view of the whole picture, then that would allow us to see at a global level what the supply chain's doing. The challenge with that is everybody has to give everything away to do it. So you sort of have to let everybody have a look in order to get the benefit. So it's a difficult challenge for us to manage, and arguably I'd say it's probably fairly unique for our industry. So like if I work in marketing or if I work in manufacturing, I can just focus on what I'm doing, make it better than the competition, and then get it in, get on with it, and ideally keep moving the business forward. In our space, that there's a level of maturity that's required, that we know most of the stuff that we do where it touches an external partner, we have to try and do it in harmonization. And sometimes that includes with our competitors, which is is definitely unique to this space.
Yeah, for sure. And Chris, maybe I can come back to you as well. Anything further you want to say about digitalisation and the digital landscape in warehousing?
Yeah, and I'd just like to build on James's point as well, Claire, because I think there's some really, really sort of key things in there. It's because our industry has changed so quickly and can't go back to how it was before. It has had to adapt. It has to be more flexible. There's a danger that organisations will become a bit siloed in their approach. Now, I think there's more and more pressure on organisations because of the pandemic. And if we are going to successfully grow, if we are going to successfully create that competitive advantage that James referred to, then I think we need to have an open mind when it comes to digitalisation, and we need to support each other through that and almost collaborate and be brave enough to potentially collaborate with our competitors, so that we are, look at the electric trucks piece as an example. Potentially, why couldn't a number of warehouse providers go out there and source electric trucks together? It reduces the cost of investment. It delivers something beneficial to each of those collaborators, and actually it means that they can focus on making their products better. It means they can focus on the core elements of their business. I think as we continue to evolve, as businesses continue to come under pressure, I think there does have to be more mutually beneficial partnerships. You see it in other industries already. I think, and I'm sure that our delegates today can see this all over the world. You see shared retail space all of the time, and that's happening more and more. You see multi-purpose hospitality venues. You even see office space now. People sharing office space, particularly as the where people work has evolved as well. Why can't we bring this into the warehousing industry? And digitalisation is a huge opportunity to do that, because it will really help direct our business operations moving forward. And I think where we're struggling with, I saw some in the chat about some of the external struggles. There are so many challenges for us to cope with from a macro perspective at the moment, where we can collaborate and where we can do things together. And goes back to your point, Claire, around digitalisation is an enabler of that. And I think sharing that, whether that's resources, whether that's data or information, is a huge opportunity for us as an industry.
Wow. So I think what you're saying is that sometime in the future, James's warehouse is going to have some Pepsi in it as well.
Why not?
I can tell you the answer to that is no.
Okay, so I do want to get on to some of the questions. As you've mentioned, we've got some interesting questions coming in on the chat, but I just got one final question of my own to pose to both of you. And I think we've touched on it a bit already, around what you think the barriers might be. What's preventing warehouse operators from adopting more digital processes or becoming more aligned with suppliers and customers? And have you got any examples you can share about that? And Chris, maybe I could come to you first. Maybe just touch on some of the barriers to digitalisation for us.
Yeah, I think first and foremost for me, there's probably a lack of understanding necessarily around where the opportunities are to use digitalisation more in the future. There are so many organisations out there now, whether they're huge multi-corporate organisations with global footprints that offer different opportunities in that space, to small startup companies that have, you know, a huge amount of young talent that operates in a completely different way and brings something completely unique to how we could potentially operate. And I think for somebody such as myself, looking at that huge infrastructure of opportunity, it's difficult to necessarily understand where to turn because there's so much opportunity, and it's evolving and changing so quickly. So I think that potentially is a barrier to its penetration of warehouse providers. And then, you know, it goes back to some of the points I made earlier. Return on investment is so important. You know, whatever we do in the digitalisation space, it needs to give us a return quickly. Gone are the days where, you know, you look at potentially 10 to 15 year paybacks on investment, because organisations can't invest in that way anymore, because the economies of the world are so volatile, and unfortunately we see that every single day. There's something different that we see on the news. So having, you know, being brave to be able to make key decisions in that space are going to be critical for its continued evolution as well.
For sure, yeah. Okay, and James, do you think you need to be brave, or are there other barriers involved? What's stopping people from digitalising?
Similar to the sentiment of what Chris is saying, I think that the biggest challenge is if you look at what's happening with the economy today, and you might, in the same supply chain, you might have one company that's working out whether it's going to be profitable this week or not. You know, because it's a transport company and the fuel's just gone up, labour prices have gone up, truck rental costs have gone up, and all that sort of stuff. And then at the same time, you might have somebody that's working with them that's got a pot of capital that they're willing to go and spend on some sort of digital infrastructure investment. So there's that, I suppose the imbalance of resources in terms of what's available for people to go and invest. And then it's layers and layers and layers of complexity. So if you think about all the different people that are involved in a supply chain, you've got all the manufacturers, you've then got the consumers right at the end, you've got all the people that are then selling the products in the middle, whether that, you know, a retailer or an outlet. There's then lots of different service providers, like a haulage company or a warehousing company. They're not showing up just to be helpful, they're trying to make money as well. So, you know, they're looking for competitive advantage. And then digitalisation then brings, you know, you've then got a layer of tech providers that have all got an individual solution, you know, that they want to provide to the businesses. So you've got this huge sort of spread of different things going on at the same time, and the challenge is trying to get them harmonised and bring them all together. And as I said, the paradox, the biggest paradox with this industry is that at exactly the same time that the industry desperately needs everybody to, you know, to pull together and harmonise, each individual part of it still needs to, you know, fulfill their own requirements to remain competitive and keep that advantage. So you've got two opposing forces that are pulling against each other at the same time, and it's trying to find, is there a way to make them work together and make it work for everyone? And I think that's the key, that it takes a level of maturity that, you know, is probably not quite there yet. And we'd have to sit down and say, well, we still want everyone in the supply chain to make some money, because, you know, that's everyone's right as a business. At the same time, we'd need everyone to do it in a way that works, and that, you know, it takes a level of trust and maturity. So I'd say that's the biggest barrier.
Yeah, okay, that definitely makes sense. And I think it's probably worth just mentioning the Electronic Trade Documents Bill, which you know, we're talking about more broadly today, and which I know the ICC have been leading some of the global work on harmonisation there. But my observation about warehousing companies, at least, is that this is not particularly a high priority. And I think that goes back to the point about different businesses having different perspectives. The legal risks, I think, are perceived, at least, to be quite low. And so there are numbers of warehousing companies which are already using electronic documents, but potentially doing it at risk. And with the adoption of this bill, that level of risk will reduce. But I'm not sure that it's really going to practically change what warehouse companies are doing on a day-to-day basis, because I think a lot of companies are already using electronic documents, irrespective of the legal status. Having said that, I think now is probably a good time to have a look at more closely at some of the questions that have been coming in. And thank you for our moderators for putting those through. So there's a question that came in fairly early on about what pressures we're feeling from supply chain disruption worldwide. So you'll remember the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal. That became a bit of a sort of global story of disruption. But of course, we've had COVID, and a bit closer to home, the regulatory changes connected with Brexit have made a difference, certainly in our part of Western Europe. Would either of you like to, maybe I'll come to you first, James, and you can tell us a bit about the impact of worldwide supply chain disruption in your business.
Yeah, I think the things that are happening have been well documented, you know, in terms of rising commodity costs, rising utility costs, availability of labour would be the main three, I think. I'll just talk about the challenge it gives us as a business, I think, because that's, you know, there's the thing that's happening, but then it's like, what does it mean in real terms to a business? And there's two layers to it for us. So one is, step one is, does it impact the availability of our product or not? So when you look across the full supply chain, can we keep our products available? And that's the first challenge, and you know what we look to try and source first. So we try and make sure that we get the resources that we need locked in to keep the product available. You know, in the main, we're able to do that. The challenge is then how do you absorb that the additional cost and the complexity to be able to do that? So and that obviously creates, you know, a cost that runs throughout the supply chain. And that's if there's one area where everybody's feeling it at the moment, it's if you're fortunate enough, which sounds crazy to say, but fortunate enough that you can get what you need and keep the products available. It's then how do you do that at a cost that remains competitive, so that you can, you know, ideally protect the people that are buying your products as much as possible from passing that pressure down the supply chain.
Okay, yeah. So it's about making sure you can supply, and then thinking, and can we do this in a profitable way as well?
Yeah.
And that's the ideal, isn't it? Is it the same for you, Chris, in Pentland?
Yeah, very much so. You know, I think the number one focus for us is maintaining availability of our product to our consumers in whichever market they're in. But that just becomes significantly more and more challenging. I think the sort of in-house joke that we have, as I'm sure James will have, and other organisations, is that you know, the crazy world that we live in has actually become the new normal, because we have experienced so much in the last 2 years. But that's only going to continue. You know, there's been a global pandemic, and we're still seeing impacts of that pandemic. You know, Shanghai's just gone into another lockdown. We have factories in Shanghai. We have a huge domestic market in China. So there is an impact there. There's continued lack of availability of containers in the Far East. Vessel transit times are taking longer and longer. There's a shortage of drivers, not just in the UK, but globally. There's a queue of 100 ships going into Long Beach at the moment, which takes 40% of all US imports. There are rising inflation in the majority of markets. There is a shortage of availability. Of labour. There's a shortage of talent generally in our industry. There's a lack of diversity and inclusion within our industry as well. So there are a huge number of challenges that we need to overcome. But actually, that's what makes it so enjoyable to work in this sector, because it's very varied. There's always something different going on. It builds a huge level of resilience. If people like to problem solve and make a difference, then they're definitely in the right sector. So, you know, where there's challenges, there's opportunity. But fundamentally, the objective, you know, is to maintain availability, and that means that we have to do things differently and are doing things differently. And there is things, multiple new things that we will continue to do to enable us to do that.
Wow. So I think in summary, I think what both of you are saying is that supply chain disruption worldwide is a curse, but it's also an opportunity. So I'm going to move on to another question, which is about technologies. And this one is, what technologies would you say are essential for the future? And the person posing the question is mentioned track and trace, digital ID, automated vehicles, and I'm sure you guys will have others that you're exploring within your own businesses. Is there anything that you've kind of hit upon that you'd be prepared to mention publicly, where you're thinking, this is the future, this is what we need to go after in terms of technology?
I think if I just jump in quickly, then for me, I've probably already covered it. It's end-to-end transparency within the supply chain every step of the way, so that we've got full visibility of our product, but also our consumer has full visibility as well. And as I said, not just to know where it is, that's a given now. There's an expectation from consumers that they always know where their product is before it arrives at their door or in the store that they want to go and purchase it from. It's everything you do, it's the how you do it, the how you operate, and the transparency around that. And to ensure that is a digital ecosystem as well. We don't want to be storing that on spreadsheets. We don't want to be storing that writing it down on pieces of paper, which we've mentioned a couple of times already this morning. It's been able to have that digital ecosystem of an end-to-end transparent supply chain that has a significant amount of complexity, a significant amount of internal and external stakeholders. So I've not seen the technology yet that's going to deliver that. I'm sure there's lots of people significantly cleverer than me out there that are working on it, but that for me is the next stage, is that transparency piece.
Sure. Okay. And James?
Yeah, I think interesting to be asked the question after just saying that, trust and maturity and being able to harmonize and sharing what we're doing is really important. I think there's definitely an opportunity for sure in sharing information around the different flows in supply chain. So if you looked across, say, warehouse as a sector, or you looked across transport as a sector, there would be a reasonable amount of available capacity that that people could be borrowing or utilizing off each other, and therefore not having to go out and source their own. So we would regularly see, if we looked at transport flows as an example, you'd have trucks that are running past each other empty, and if there was the ability for people to collaborate in that space, arguably there'd be a significant shift in terms of efficiency and taking out waste and dead cost. I think the thing that's definitely going in our favor now is the requirement and the drive to really reduce carbon and look at it through a sustainability lens will help us do things differently. I think asking people to share their data and work together to try and somehow wrestle some extra profitability out of the process for everyone is one thing. Saying we now need to do it to make sure we protect the planet is different. You show up with a different conversation and a different level of willingness. So I think for me it would be finding a way to be able to share data in a harmonized way that allows people to take meaningful action, as in things like sharing trucks or sharing warehouses.
Okay, and have you any thoughts on how that standardization could be achieved? Because it does sound like a sort of holy grail that we might want to get to, but it's also, I guess it will rely on some standards being set. Is that a role for business themselves? Is that a role for trade associations like mine? Is that something that governments should do, or does the International Chamber of Commerce play a part? Who sets the standards? How do you envisage that might work?
I think it's unlikely to come from within industry. So if we would be reasonably influential, in our supply chain because of our size and scale, and how well known the brands are and that kind of stuff. It's unlikely, however, that we would show up and say, we're now going to do this and we need everybody else to do it as well. So is it all right if everybody chips in and we all do it together? That conversation is really difficult to land. So for me, it has to come independently. It has to come from a trade body, from government, from somewhere outside of within the industry, because ultimately it needs somebody that's got the ability to be able to look across the whole thing and make the right decision in the interest of of the global supply chain system, rather than any component part of it. And again, I think this is a hearts and minds thing, right? So we could sit and say, well, can we develop the technology to do this? Absolutely, the technology's out there. So that's not the challenge. The challenge is, how do we get everybody onto a page where they'll work together on it? And I think for me, sustainability and carbon reduction is the in. So there's no longer, and Chris talked about it, you can't have a sustainability agenda and a digital agenda. Like the two are intrinsically linked now.
For sure. Okay. And Chris, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely concur with that. I think, there's an appetite, there's a requirement at an industry level, but somebody needs to help bring that together. And, I definitely, your organisation, Clare, ICC, other government bodies, I think can be that facilitator, because, at the moment, there's lots of good ideas, there's lots of technology in the industry, as we know, but actually a coordination and facilitation of that, I think, is the critical element to drive that forward, and to bring those key stakeholders together to do so.
For sure. And I guess in both of your businesses, I imagine that you use the what's now quite old-fashioned tech of barcodes. And we have this organisation GS1 that helps to sort of coordinate the assigning of different barcodes and the way that codes are used. So I'm thinking potentially it's a similar type of approach that's needed. And that was definitely something that was supported by industry, but had to come from a separate body, from somebody kind of outside of any one business. So we're approaching the time when we need to wrap up. There's a question that's come up about SME warehouses, and I do just want to acknowledge that obviously here we're talking to two enormous brands, whereas at the UK Warehousing Association we do also represent smaller warehousing companies as well. I think the role of digitisation for SMEs is something that the UK Warehousing Association is researching at the moment with Cambridge University, and we're finding that there are barriers to adoption, and one of them is the availability of management time. Warehousing, particularly 3PL warehousing, is a low margin business, and we have labour shortages. So people that are responsible for making strategic decisions are really kind of firefighting in a lot of cases, and struggling to find the time and the headspace to think about the opportunities of digitalisation. And I suppose we've heard a little bit of that from you two, James and Chris, but I would suggest that's even more prevalent in SME, small and medium enterprises. We've got, I think, some key actions there that I'm just going to summarise before I hand back to Chris. So the first that has come across loud and clear from both of you is the idea about collaborating and sharing data. I think, we all need to be a bit more imaginative about how far we could go when it comes to collaborating across businesses that may see themselves as competitors. The second is about looking for new tools and new digital ideas for not just tracking where things are, but also supporting more complex needs of stakeholders. For example, the kind of carbon footprint of goods and some of the environmental things that you both spoke about. And the third key action I think we need to do goes back to the point about people. And I know you said at the beginning, James, oh, well, the people development part of your interest maybe doesn't apply here. But I would say by the end of this conversation, we're kind of concluding that hearts and minds part is really important. So that the third key action is to win people over to the idea that we need to set standards and we need to change. So it's about collaborating and sharing. It's about looking out for new tools that will help us do more digitally. And it's about winning people over to both of those ideas. So thank you ever so much to Chris and James. And I'm now going to hand back over to the other Chris.
Thanks very much, Claire. Too many Chris's, I'm afraid, everybody. What a fascinating conversation. I think so much of this is relevant to the wider conversations that we're hearing, particularly around sustainability and digitalisation as an enabler. And I also think there's a real common thread there in terms of, the sort of convening needs to come from almost outside the sector, but in partnership with the sector. That's a common thread. In fact, that's one of the reasons why we're launching a new public-private partnership on Friday. So that is super relevant. How do we cross over all sectors to facilitate the conversation for everybody, where there's clearly a big prize to be had, but where we all need to contribute, because it's almost too much of a big ask actually to go to, I think, to one sector at a time, or that can't solve the solution on its own. So I think some really common threads, really interesting conversation. I must admit, I've learned a terrific amount. So thank you very much, Claire. Thank you, James and Chris. Really nice to have you here. This is quite a different conversation for ICC. So, you know, let's continue the conversation and totally take up the action points, which we will certainly feed into the action plan at the end of the conference, and obviously look forward to working with you going forward. For our audience, thank you very much for your participation and listening. Really appreciate that. Let's continue this conversation in the future. And if I could just point everybody to the next webinar, which is on modernising trade practices and building the business case in the finance sector, not a million miles away from this conversation. That kicks off at 2 o'clock British Standard Time, Greenwich Mean Time, and look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much, everybody.